So hello to those who are just joining us. Good morning and welcome to number 3 of the procurement webinar series from Forbes. We are just waiting for the numbers to go up. As I have said, we are going to start quite quickly because we do have an awful lot to get through this morning. But welcome, it's lovely to see you all. Thank you for joining us. Now, got lots more people joining now, so that's good. I'll give it another minute or so before we kick off. Hope you're all well. Got an awful lot to talk about this morning, as I'm sure you can imagine. So it's going to be quite interesting. Daniel and I are going to try and juggle about 700 slides between the two of us, but we'll do it. We'll smash it. We will smash it. Good morning and welcome to those just joining us. Nice to see you. Welcome to our webinar. We're just going to give it another minute or so. We've had a question actually about whether or not you can access the prior recordings for procurement. Yes, I think we can do actually. They were all recorded. I'm pretty sure that I've seen them. So yeah, we can either send you the links if you let us know after this, or I don't even know if they're on YouTube. Perhaps our Dan's going to answer the question. Fire away, Dan.
Well, I think the answer is they've certainly all been recorded. So knowing that we have some of our super capable events team doing the background support for us today, I have no doubt that the person who's asked that question can be provided with the previous recordings. And certainly there'll be a follow-up email to this one, which will certainly include all the slides. And it's certainly worth making a point at this stage. We're not going to read out all the slides today.
No.
Part of the function of the slide deck that you'll be sent is it's a little bit of a reference guide that walks through the various notices you might have to publish in the course of the life of a procurement.
You stop stealing my bit. I'm saying this bit.
But I have just seen a predictably efficient response from our behind the scenes team. Yes, they are all on the YouTube. So fingers crossed it's out there for you to find, and I will hand over to you, Gemma, to get us kicked off.
Yeah, we need to crack on. We've got an awful lot to go through today, everybody. So welcome. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you already know us, but I'm Gemma Duxbury and I'm a partner in the commercial public sector team. And Daniel is, well, I can only describe him as the Oracle of Forbes. That's all I'm going to describe him as. He is our real procurement expert who I assist on these matters. Welcome to part 3 of our webinar series with regards to the new Procurement Act. I'm going to share the screen with you now. Bear with me because I'm terrible with technology. Everybody knows this, so I'm going to do my best. So hopefully you can now see that. Thank you, Dan. I've got the thumbs up. So this is read all about it. There's mine and Dan's details. You will get copies of the slides, so please don't feel like you have to be writing down rapidly because we are going to be going through a lot of content. You will have the slides as a reference point. We're not going to read everything out because we will literally be here until the end of time. So effectively, we're going to tell you what's really the practicalities of doing a procurement process under the Act, and the policy and the tactical things that you need to be thinking about. So in this session, we're looking at what's the point, read all about what, how do I work this, and what about. So if I hand over to you, Dan, to take over with regards to the notices. You're on silent, I think, Dan.
Not anymore. Right. If delegates can see the slides, that's great. They're not on my screen, but I've got a paper copy in front of me. So if you've got screen share going, it may be that whatever presenter screen I'm in isn't showing them. But we needn't worry. If people can see them, then I'm okay. I've got a set here. Exactly. Okay. So why do we have this vast profusion of notices? Why is there so much more under the new Procurement Act than there used to be under the current public contracts regulations? Well, the answer is there in section 12 of the legislation, these are the objectives. And A and B, that's the whole point of procurement as we'd understood it historically. What we now see is C and D, which is that we don't only have to do A and B, we have to explain how we did it, show our working at all stages. And you might even say, invite people to say we didn't do it right. And certainly, having dealt with the procurement challenge recently, the more you tell people, the more they throw it back at you. So there's always the possibility. And of course, under Part D, who can say they don't intend to act with integrity? So you're rather like saying in your CV that you're not a team player. It's not the done thing. We're all going to act with integrity. So what's to argue with? That's where it is. What does that translate to? Next slide, please, Gemma. It translates to this. This is Regulation 5 of the Procurement Regulations 2024, which is an even more exciting read than the Procurement Act itself, and literally from A to Z. These are the 26 different things the regulations envisage you having to publish. Some of these are notices. Some of them are just statements in the regulations that you must publish things. The medium through which you do that, I think you're picking up later on, Gemma, in the practicality section, the central repository. So let's get on to the first stage of the procurement life cycle.
Sorry, trigger happy.
No, go for it.
The slides, Dan? Can you see them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go. Yeah, perfect. So why would you start publishing notices before you've even started your procurement? Why would you even want to do that? Well, there's two reasons. Number one, because you have to in some cases. Number two, because it suits you. So let's start with the one you can't avoid. So the next slide, please. Pipeline notices. Now, you might be of the view that spending over £100 million on public contracts in a year isn't anything that your particular organisation is likely to be doing. I do know from the delegate list, we do have organisations represented today who are in this kind of marketplace. So it falls into the category, perhaps, of problems that it's nice to have. If you've got a £100 million budget that you intend to spend, good for you, but you might need to publish a pipeline notice. So effectively, if you are a serious player in the field of procuring public contracts, you've got to let the market know the kind of requirements you've got coming up in the forthcoming year. And you've got within a couple of months at the start of that financial year to indicate each and every contract in excess of £2 million. So I'm hoping your 100 million isn't made up of 51 contracts at £2 million each, because that is going to be pretty onerous. Fingers crossed you've got some chunkier ones in there and you'll have a little less detail to put in the notice. So that's the very first one. But what you'll notice is this is section 93 of the Act. Don't follow the section numbers, but you will see they jump around. So we're doing it in chronological order, which will hopefully make a little more sense. The next one is a planned procurement notice. This one is optional. This is what's currently called a PIN, or a procurement information notice. So why would you bother? Well, the advantage, as with a PIN, of publishing one of these is that the time limits for procurement responses in section 54 of the Procurement Act 23 are shortened if you've published one of these first. So if you look at all of this information coming up here about what goes in the notice, then it is fairly clear that what you're putting out there is all the information about what you're planning to do, when it's going to be coming forward, which kind of procurement process you're going to use, and effectively teeing up people as much as possible to be ready to jump in on that procurement where there may be a shorter timescale. So second slide for this notice, please. Thank you. So all of the information is there that you have to put in, but what is particularly relevant is when. It's voluntary, but it's got to be at least 40 days before the associated tender notice to let everybody get ready. But it can't be more than 12 months old when you then publish the tender notice to start a formal procurement. So there is an element of use it or lose it about one of these. If you leave one out there for too long, it stops working. So if you've published one of these and then you're experiencing a delay getting the actual procurement off the ground, do bear in mind that you might need to refresh the notice or publish another one. I can see that we've got a couple of questions there, one of which I know is from a professional procurement expert. So I will give that one some thought. And have a look at how I might answer that in the Q&A section at the end. I think the value of a £2 million contract for the purposes of the first question we've got, that one I can deal with. It will be the life of the contract because that's how it's valued. No valuation under the current regulations or the Procurement Act is done on a per year basis. It will be lifetime of the contract. So in theory, yes, longer term services contracts could get up to that kind of level. It wouldn't just necessarily be your projects and building work. Okay. So let's get into the next stage of the procurement process. So next slide, please, Gemma. So this is where the balloon goes up, the hair is running. If you're a fan of Western movies, this is where the pianola player suddenly stops and the saloon goes quiet, and you know there's an action scene about to come forward. So let's take a look at tender notices. And what you have here is the first example of many where there are multiple customized versions of what goes in the notice, depending on the kind of procurement that you are doing. So what you've got here is 2 slides worth, next slide please, of information on what goes in the tender notice for an open procedure. So this is your basic procedure, simplest available one-stage version. All of this is in the tender notice to begin with. And as is a frequent point you will see elsewhere, you can include other relevant information if you want to. So that would suggest, and without stealing Gemma's material entirely, when we actually see a version of what one of these notices looks like, assuming there is some sort of free text section where you can add to it. And as a data protection lawyer, there's nothing better than a free text box for people to get themselves into trouble. So, okay, let's go to the next one, please. So if you're going 2-stage process, competitive flexible.
Oh, sorry.
However you're going to do that, back up. Thank you. Back up another one.
Sorry, got trigger happy.
Right, so onto competitive flexible. Sorry, I've gone back too far. There we go, perfect. So notice there, third bullet down, description of the procedure, including any negotiation stages or any plans to refine the award criteria. And we've talked about this in previous sessions. Refining the award criteria as you go is one of the things that you can do under the Procurement Act 23. But note here that competitive flexible is not a complete free-for-all. Usual classical procurement rules apply. You've got to say up front what the procedure is going to be. It's got to be in the tender notice, and then you can't change it. You can refine the award criteria, but only if you've said you're going to. So it's another example of all the compliance is front-loaded. You've got to know at the time you put that tender notice out how your competitive flexible procedure is going to work. So definitely time to be thinking about that now rather than next month. So next slide, please, Gemma. So what you've then got is the variation of this for frameworks. And under frameworks, that would also include open frameworks. Next version of this, please, Gemma, is the dynamic market version. And remember, as we addressed in the last session, a dynamic market is not a public contract. It is simply an access mechanism for participation in a tendering process. So what you will find is a lot of the compliance requirements for dynamic market are not quite as onerous as they would be for live tendering for contracts. Okay, next thing to take a look at, below threshold tender notice. So notice here that we no longer have or won't have going forward the distinction we currently have between contracts finder for little contracts and FTS for big contracts. There is going to be one platform where all of this is published. You will just put up a below threshold tender notice under Section 87 rather than any other kind of tender notice that you might be publishing. So all the usual information in here, still got to note in advance what will your award criteria be. So again, although it's sub-threshold, although you are not going to have to do the full procurement process, you've still got to commit to your award criteria and any conditions for participation. And this is similar to Contracts Finder before you advertise. Now that is unless you are only advertising to invite tenders from particular or pre-selected suppliers. So same rule as it is for Contracts Finder at the moment. If you're not genuinely openly advertising, may not have to do this. And as I notice, we have a strong representation from the education sector taking part in our session today. I will flag up at this point that this is one of the publication requirements that does not apply to schools. So I will take a brief sidebar to point you to section 123 of the Procurement Act 2023, which contains the definition of school. Because you might think you know what a school is, and the Procurement Act has other ideas. There are five things, all of which are a school. Maintain schools, academy schools, Education Act approved schools, further education institutions for the purposes of section 91 of the Further and Higher Education Act 92, and grant-aided schools in Northern Ireland. So not, as I would read that, universities, but I think that does cover FE colleges, depending on whether you get yourself within section 91 of that particular piece of legislation. So there are some other elements here that are exempted for schools, and I'll try to flag those as we go along. So next one, please, Gemma. Dynamic market notices. Now, having said that there's not as much compliance for a dynamic market, there's still 26 elements in a dynamic market notice. So they're not actually that much shorter than everything else. And again, you would have to have decided pretty clearly up front how you're going to establish your dynamic market and how it's going to work. So you need to have thought through, is it split into parts? Are there geographical elements in it? When are the intended operation dates? Are there any fees for placing contracts through it? CPV codes for what you're going to include. So you need to be ready to go with dynamic market as much as with anything else. But notice, before you establish, and then as soon as reasonably practical, after you establish it, after you modify it, and after it ceases. Slightly lighter touch here on dynamic markets. It does not have the same super strict time limits as you will find elsewhere in the regulations. So we're making pretty good progress here, which is good news because we're about to get to the really chunky bit. So next slide, please, Gemma. Results stage. So we've warned the market as to what's coming and how we're going about our preliminary market engagement, if that's what we're going to do. And we've published our tender notice, we've got the responses, we've done the assessment, we're good to go, it's results day. So what do we have to do? Well, let's start with transparency notices. So first thing to flag here, these are not the same as VEET notices under the current regulations. The key distinction being that in a VEET notice, V is voluntary transparency notice. These are not voluntary, these are mandatory transparency notices used where you have placed a contract by direct award under sections 41 or 43, and I think also 42, but I think 42 is the one you're less likely to be using. That is the pandemic PPE excuse clause in the new legislation. So if you've made that direct award using one of the direct award grounds that you will find in Schedule 5 on the back of the legislation, all the information about the contracting authority, of which there is loads, the title, the unique identifier for the procurement itself, and of any procurement that's moved over to direct award, because that's what Section 43 is, starts as a competitive procedure, moves to direct award, probably because you've only had one bid or you've had no qualifying bids. If you've got lots, you've got to talk about those. You've got to talk about the estimated value. Another feature that you'll see throughout these suite of notices, is this a contract that's appropriate for SMEs or NGOs or social enterprises to bid for? Certainly a lot of the social enterprises I work with would say they'd be happy to have a go at almost anything, but there may be some things that perhaps are particularly suited. So before you award the contract is where you have to publish one of these. So not the same thing as an award notice, because we're going to come to those now. So an award notice is what happens at the end of a competitive procurement process. So next slide, please, Gemma. Section 50. So one thing to pick out here is that you have got 7 lots of information to include about the winning supplier, including associated persons and what is called connected party information. Connected party information is surprisingly wide-ranging, and it includes information as to directors, shadow directors, etc. It is a real deep dive into the winning organisation. So number one, you need to be capturing all that information, ensuring it's available, ensuring that the winning supplier has registered where they need to be with all of that information ready for you to use. Notice also partway down there, this applies to framework awards. And if it's a contract awarded under a framework, so not the creation of a framework itself, this applies to call-offs. And contrast that with Regulation 50 in the current public contract regulations, which say you don't need to have an award notice for a call-off under a framework. Hopefully, it's in Section 50 of the new Act as well, where we find that the assessment summary isn't required for a call-off under a framework, and we'll come to it later, possibly also not a standstill period, but there does need to be an award notice. So bear that in mind if you are awarding a call-off that of itself is big enough to be of attention to the regulations. So next part under that, this is where it gets really interesting because you just don't have to do this at the moment. For contracts under 5 million, you just have to say how many tenders came in, how many tenders made it through to assessment. So you're saying here, how many tenders got knocked out at SQ stage or during clarifications or abnormally low bids or any of that kind of thing and didn't make it through to final assessment. You also have to indicate how many of the tenders you assessed were from the SME, social enterprise, NGO sector, unless you're doing a direct award. But if you're doing a direct award, you've already had to publish a transparency notice. So that's why this doesn't apply to you. For contracts over 5 million, and I would say at this stage, that's going to include an awful lot of frameworks and an awful lot of construction contracts. Not only must you have to give the total number of tenders submitted, you have to give the name and address and contact details of each unsuccessful bidder whose tender was assessed. So not only do you have to publish the winner, like you have to do now, you also have to name all of the losing bidders. So you might wonder, why perhaps do we have to enable all of the losing bidders to find each other? Well, perhaps it's so they can arrange some sort of group counselling session, or they can maybe book some training to see if they could do better next time. The more cynical amongst you might say, that's going to make it a lot easier for the losing bidders to club together and see if they want to chip in to have a go at the winner or the contracting authority. It will also, speaking as an organisation that bids for public contracts, it will influence our decisions about which contracts we do and don't bid on, because depending on the nature of the contract, it may or may not be advantageous to publicise the fact that we bid for it and didn't get it. And I wouldn't be surprised if a number of bidders might feel the same way. So, possible tactical point here, how far into the process towards assessment do you want to take somebody before they have the opportunity to withdraw? Because you only have to name the losing bidders whose bid went to final assessment. So if you're putting together or designing a competitive flexible procedure, you might want to leave the back door open for somebody who isn't going to win to take a view and not go to final assessment. So potentially that might make one process a little more attractive to bidders than another. That's speculation at this stage. We'll have to see how it plays out. If you are going to have a standstill date, standstills now are started, remember, by the award notice, not by the procurement assessment that you have to send everybody. So bear that in mind. And it is voluntary standstill for direct awards, awards under frameworks, awards by reference to a dynamic market, and light touch contracts. So you may have to give an award notice, but it doesn't mean you necessarily have to fill in the bit about standstill. So again, check whether it applies to you or not. And if it isn't mandatory, decide whether you want to do it or not. And in terms of remedies and potential litigation, the usual rule will apply. If you have given a transparency notice, it potentially gives you another line of defence if things turn nasty at a later stage. So I can see, Gemma, we've got a few things in the Q&A. So
we do. I didn't want to leap in. Did you want to address them at the end or look at them now?
I haven't got them on the screen at the moment.
Okay, I can ask you. We've answered one. There was for procurements under 2 million, do they need to pre-publish a notice?
No, the preliminary notice, what used to be a PIN, is optional. You don't have to do it, but if you do publish it, then it gives you the opportunity to shorten the timescales when you actually run the procurement itself. Publishing notices doesn't include the use of framework. Well, award notices do apply to awards under a framework, although standstill doesn't necessarily. No, if contracts have been awarded prior to the Act, absolutely not. No, the transitional provisions are, as we touched on in the previous session, if the procurement process started under the current legislation, so that would include now, and I have at least one client who's still planning to start some before the rules change, old rules apply under anything that starts before the law changes. And that's that one. Which notices we need in connection with the framework? Quite a few of them, as we're hopefully going to pick up as we go along. So I think that's hopefully broadly up to date with the questions, apart from that fiddly one about groups, which I'll give some thought to while you're doing your bit, Gemma, and try and come back to it at the end. So,
great. Well done, Don.
That's award notices. Excellent stuff. Let's move on. Got the award notice used to be all you had to do, but it isn't anymore. Because you've now got to give also the contract details notice, and note halfway down the slide there, for contracts over 5 million, you've got to publish the contract itself as well. And that certainly feels like quite an imposition. It feels like a significant change. Although it is fair to say you've probably also published the contract as part of the ITT. But swings and roundabouts, the ITT has probably only been viewed by people who are interested in bidding, whereas the contract, when you finally publish it, is up there on the portal for every man and his dog to see. So consider at this point what has to be in the contract and what might possibly be referred to by implication or reference to a document that isn't actually there, if there's anything you're trying to keep out of the public domain. So you've got contract details notice for open or competitive flexible. So the key thing here is where you've set KPIs, this is where you have to say what they are and how often you're going to assess them. If you haven't set the 3 KPIs that the Act says you should be setting, this is where you explain why you couldn't. And we're going to come back to the higher priority that KPIs are going to have under the new legislation later on. So there is a version of this for frameworks. So next slide, please. Harking back to that question. Where you have awarded a framework, you have to say how you created it, what the mechanism is going to be for pricing call-offs, and what the selection process is going to be for call-offs. So, and for a contract, for a framework where the total value of call-offs is expected to exceed 5 million, you're publishing the framework notice as well. Notice in all of these, you've got longer for a light touch than you have for other kinds. You've got to get your skates on if you're doing a regular kind of contract. And again, to be absolutely clear what we're saying about frameworks, next one, please. Call-offs or contracts awarded under a framework in the language of the regulations, not voluntary. You are going to have to do this. And you've got to specify whether it was a direct award or a mini competition. So given that there is that specific requirement, this absolutely is deliberately referring to call-offs under a framework. Because direct award or mini competition, or in the language of the regulation, without reopening competition or with reopening competition, must be frameworks because it can't mean anything else.
Mm.
So again, if the call-off's worth over 5 million, you've got to publish the call-off as well. So if you've had a direct award, you've then got to publish contract details notice, even though there isn't an award notice, because you've already done the transparency notice. And notice halfway down there, if you have awarded this to an excluded supplier, notwithstanding that they were excluded, you have to specify what criminal offence they had committed to be excluded, and notwithstanding which you're still awarding that particular provider the contract. So my illegal advice to you at this stage is, if you find yourself having to fill that bit of the notice in, you may want to pause and consider how you got to where you are. Because if you're awarding to an excluded provider with relevant criminal convictions, you really want to be absolutely sure you've made the right choice. So we've then got contract details notices for below threshold. So again, for your sub-threshold contracting, you're going to be publishing one of these. Not exempt for schools. Exempt to advertise it possibly, but not exempt from saying you've awarded it when you get there. So you are going to create a footprint under the regulations one way or the other. Next one, procurement termination notices. So this is where you abandon the process and don't make an award. So you've got to give specified information, but not, as I read the requirements of the legislation, not the reason for your decision, merely the fact that you've made one. And that's interesting because I've been advising on one of these recently under the current regulations, and as it stands at the moment, you do have to say why you did it in order that you can specify that you had objective reasons. So we'll have a look at that notice when we see it, just to see how much in detail it is looking for. So next stage of the procurement life cycle, ongoing reporting as to contractual performance. So let's take a look at those. Part one, payment compliant notices. Good news, schools and FE colleges, you are exempt from this one, because you are also exempt from the underlying 30-day payment requirement, which is implied into other people's public contracts by the legislation. So you have to report for sums paid in that relevant reporting period, broken down by the average number of days from invoice to payment, and less than 30, 30 to 60, and above 60. Lots of information there. And not only do you have to put this out there, your FD or equivalent has got to put their name on it. When do you have to publish? It's a 6-monthly rolling process. So whenever your contract starts, the next point at which you hit the 31st of March or the 30th of September, that's the end of your first reporting period, and you've then got 30 days to publish. So, and it relates to all public contracts. So when you become, when this bites on you, that's when your, as a contracting authority, your performance, your payment compliance notice requirement begins. And that just keeps rolling and keeps rolling and keeps rolling. So you may or may not have a proactive publication scheme. You may or may not be subject to FOI, but you're certainly going to have to do all of this. So other new things, contract performance notices. There are 2 varieties, and you may have to do both if things go south. First one, KPIs. So where you have set KPIs, at least once every 12 months and on termination of the contract, remember that, I'm coming back to that at the end, you must assess every supplier against every KPI, and you must use this 5-stage grading. Any resemblance to the Ofsted single word report is, I am sure, entirely coincidental. I notice it is impossible to achieve outstanding. The best you can ever do is good. And there are 3 grades of less than good. And there's the interesting unclassified cannot be described. That doesn't mean it's so bad that you have no words for it. It means that somehow, even though you set KPIs, for some reason, you're not able to form an assessment at this point. So the next type of contract performance notice is to do with breach of contract or failure to perform in a satisfactory manner. So this is your mandatory naming and shaming provision. If you have an event that triggers publication of this, you've got to do it. Now, this is not the same as publishing a below target KPI report. It may be that the same circumstances justify both, and that will be for you to assess when you get there. So there needs to have been one of two varieties of outcome, one of which is section 71(3)(b), which is partial termination, damages, or a settlement, or 71(5), outright breach. Or you've got unsatisfactory performance where that has been raised with the contractor and the contractor's performance has not improved. You will notice that is almost exactly the same form of words. It is the same form of words as the new discretionary exclusion ground in the Procurement Act 23 of contractor has previously been warned and failed to improve. So what we're saying here is, as soon as somebody's got one of these published, I believe they are potentially now excludable for any ongoing procurement that anyone else is conducting as a result of that assessment that you've made. And if you've got damages, and the method of calculation has to be given, so even if you agree how much the payment should be, you may still have to say how you got to it. So other things that can happen in the life of the contract are contract amendments. So we then have contract change notices, and a couple of different varieties here, but essentially all of this information to be given. And if you're using any of paragraphs 2 to 9 of Schedule 8, which is anything other than explicit contractual clause allowing the change, which is paragraph 1, this is all the other justifications for amending a live contract. You've got to give all of that, explain when it's coming in, and you can again do a voluntary standstill period here. The notice is not voluntary, the standstill element is. Notice here, you don't have to publish if the change is only plus or minus 10% value for services, 15% for works, or the duration's only going up or down by 10%. Do, however, please note that reductions in the value of the contract and shortening the contract period do count as reportable changes. It's not only the price going up or the contract being extended. If the contract's coming back to market sooner than expected, you still have to let people know that's going to be happening. And after you've modified, you've still got a revision of the contract to be published if it's an over £5 million contract. So if you had to publish the contract initially, you've also got to publish the amendment. Termination notices. So
smashing it down.
This is another new feature that you'll recall we addressed in previous sessions. You've never had to do this before. Now you've got termination notice. So let's take a look at what's in them. Next slide, please. You've got the usual information there. The reason for termination by reference to section 80, the date, the contract value, and where the termination is as a result of a breach of contract. If that is the case, you invoke section 71(5), and again, termination of a contract for default in a public contract potentially renders that supplier excludable to other contracting authorities. And that's got to be done within 30 days. So no hanging about as and when you pull the plug. And this is whether it's expired because it's got to the end of the contract period, or whether you've terminated for breach. Whether you terminate for breach or not only dictates whether you reference section 71(5) or not. So a contract that's come to its natural end after excellent performance still generates a contract termination notice. And in theory, this actually comes ages after you've published your tender notice for the next contract, because you never wait for the contract to end before you procure the next one. So you've got overlapping series of notices. You're procuring the new one before you're reporting the end of the old one. So don't forget to officially switch off the old contract while you're busy procuring and mobilising the new one. So, question. Do you really have to publish all of this stuff? Can you plead the fifth if you're in America? Can you go no comment? Like our man in the top right corner there, he's got nothing to say. Can you pull a Vlad and decline to answer? No, in a general sense, no, because you're not running a totalitarian regime. You are not in a position to decide. However, there are exemptions. And for those of you in sectors where the Freedom of Information Act applies, you will be a little more comfortable with this. You know, we are in the realms of, I think it's around about section 41 of the FOIA here. We're invoking commercial confidentiality. That's what we have to be looking at. Notice in paragraph 3 there, if you do withhold information, you must publish the fact that you have withheld information and whether you've done that because it's for national security or commercial confidentiality. Can I suggest it's ordinarily going to be B? If you're withholding anything for national security, go and get some very heavy-duty advice as to what you are doing with your procurement. How do you go about doing that publication? Helpfully, the regulations don't tell you. They just say you have to publish it. So potentially you could put a statement on the front of your redacted contract, or you could put a statement somewhere in the relevant notice that you're publishing that pursuant to this, section 94(1)(b), information has been withheld. You obviously don't have to say which information has been withheld in any great detail, because that would rather spoil the purpose of withholding it. So, having said all of that, let's get on to dealing with this in the real world. Over to you, Gemma. I'm going to have a brew.
Have a breath, Dan. Bless you. Well done. Blimey O'Reilly, as you can see, an awful lot to take in, and Dan dealt with that brilliantly. So I'm just going to chip in now at the end with regards to how we do this. Now, obviously, this was originally meant to come in back in October, was pushed back to February with all the promises that we would have the up-to-date information, we would have the up-to-date templates and all of the support and everything that we needed for the introduction of this act. So the practicalities, how are we going to do all of this? Well, the answer to that quite bluntly is that at the moment there are no template notices available. However, there are some other resources that you can look at in relation to the introduction of the Procurement Act. One of the main ones being what's known as the procurement pathway. And this was created on the Government Commercial Function website to give you an idea of how to go down that pathway of the procurement process. And it's broken down into 4 phases, which is the plan, define, procure and manage, which is quite common sense really, isn't it? And within the procurement pathway, there is guidance and there are some templates. How helpful and useful they are is a question to ask yourself. However, they are there and they can be used. So I've just broken it down for you as best as I can. So under the first heading, which is the plan, they are advising that you develop the strategy and you plan in line with the business objectives and commercial policy outcomes, which is pretty obvious, isn't it? The templates that are available under the Procurement Act are the conflict of interest declaration form and a conflict assessment template. So there are a couple of forms there. And there is also available, they don't just have the Procurement Act stuff in there, they do also have the PCR 2015 templates as well. Because obviously, as Dan has mentioned, and as you're probably already all aware, any procurement process that start prior to the introduction of the legislation, the new Act, it still falls under the procurement, the public contract regs. So they have both sets of templates there for you to use. Just be careful because they name it and then they put in brackets afterwards which legislation it is. So PA24 or PCR 2015. When I was going through them all, I did make the Freudian slip, unfortunately, of going into a couple of the PCRs instead of the Procurement Act. So please just bear that in mind. It also does contain all of the previous procurement policy notes with regards to the legislation and the introduction of the legislation. We still haven't received the latest PPN. We are all waiting this with bated breath, but at the moment it hasn't yet landed. It also provides, through this gateway, access directly to the actual regulations, the 2015 regulations and also the 2023 Act. And it has all the sections and schedules broken down so you can go to the specific parts. Also contained within the 4 headings under the pathway, there are what are called commercial playbooks and guidance notes. And these are the best practice guidance on how to make your sourcing decisions and contracts. So under section 1, for example, it has the playbooks for public works services, digital data and technology, construction and consultancy. So within all of these 4 headings, it also does have these guidance notes, and it also has playbooks available. So just bear that in mind. Under number 2, which is the define, there are templates in there for a procurement specific questionnaire, which can be added to, adapted or omitted. There is also a direct award justification report, and there is a sourcing strategy. Now, the procurement specific questionnaire includes content to help you ensure that you have complied with the requirements in the Act. If you don't use it, you have to personally make sure that your procurement processes comply with the legislation. So it might just be useful to just use that procurement specific questionnaire as part of your process, just to make sure that you are ticking all the boxes. And again, it's providing advice with regards to strategy, plan, having clear and transparent commercial pipelines, good understanding of the market. And just to expand a bit as well on the direct award justification report, that's where it requires the contract details. If you're switching to a direct award, why there's a direct award in special cases, the direct award to protect life. And there's also there a checklist of notices and internal procedures within that report. So that can be quite helpful. Also contain, just to expand a bit more as well on the commercial sourcing strategy, that includes like an executive summary, a background, context, current status. It's basically showing all your background, all your planning, why you're doing what you're doing, how you've looked at it, what the options are, how you've assessed competition, the market, what the key personnel will be. It's helping break down, I think, a lot of the elements of what you would consider to be the contract. So that's in there. And again, it says it brings together the options analysis at the early stage. So it helps you assess your resource requirements and assure that you deliver proportionality, affordability and value for money. Also under section 2 in this procurement pathway, there are again the templates for both the Procurement Act and the regulations, policy notes, and you can access the legislation and the commercial playbooks and guidance notes as well. So still under number, so this is now under number 3, which is the procure part of the pathway, which is about finalising and publishing your procurement pack. So this is looking at your supplier engagement, how you've selected them, how you've evaluated, clarification, due diligence, the contract award and the implementation. And again, the templates in here, it has the pre-procurement checklist. You have the competitive flexible procurement template and guidance, but there is also a competitive flexible procurement template stages list. Blimey, I had to have my teeth in for that. So there's also an assessment summary with regards to the most advantageous tender, and an assessment summary for an assessed tender, and also a contract award and recommendation report. So as you can see, a lot of the documents in here, even though they're not actual templates for notices, as an example, there's a lot of guidance, and there are some templates for actually the parts that are supporting the procurement process to enable you to deliver those statutory and mandatory notices. The pre-procurement checklist. So that is to check your readiness to commence the procurement process, what you require, what the procurement process is that you select to use, how that's going to be governed and how it's going to work out, the logistics of it. How are you going to do it? The competitive flexible procurement template and guidance. So this describes how the procurement will actually be conducted, and that includes things like the timetable, the participation award criteria, and how to respond to the opportunity. Now, you should read that in conjunction with the guidance, because it is helpful and it does help you pad out the parts of the form that you require in the template. It isn't, however, mandatory. So again, a lot of these are just guidance. They are there to support you with the process itself rather than providing you with the actual legal tools, so to speak. And the competitive flexible procurement template stages list, this is quite handy because it's like a checklist of the steps to create the flexible and efficient buying process. So they kind of sit together. The assessment summary for the most advantageous tender, that it contains information about how you have assessed it and submitted it in accordance with Section 50 of the new Act. And the assessment summary for assessed tenders is the same. It provides information about how you've assessed it in accordance with Section 50. And then there's the contract award and recommendation report. That is your record of your procurement process and how you've got through it. Again, under this stage, there are the usual access to the legislation, playbooks, etc., and the PPNs. And then finally, under the last stage, which is the manage. So this is how you're managing and monitoring the contract after you've procured. So you're receiving your goods, your services, how you're issuing your payments, any contract modifications that you're making, and how you're closing the contract. The templates there are no further templates in this. It all refers to previous ones that we've looked at in the previous stages. So that I didn't feel like typing all those out again, but so it's just the same stuff that's in the previous three. And you also have available, as you can see here, the usual PPNs and the access to the legislation. Just for our education colleagues, there are other ways as well to get support at the moment, currently through the DfE website. There is guidance on how schools are to procure and buy goods and services. That is currently in situ. I don't know how that will change, or if it will change, or if it will, I mean, I assume it will have to be updated somehow. But at the moment, there is that guidance in place. And there is also a procurement service through the DfE that educational institutions can use. Unfortunately, that's not open to everybody else. But I mean, you know, guidance is guidance, and I always think it's helpful in understanding any legislation. So hopefully that has given you a bit of a steer. I can't give you any more templates than that at the moment because there quite simply aren't any. And as you can see from Dan's slides and his part of the presentation, you can quite clearly see that the sections of the Act actually clearly state what is required in the notices. We just don't know how it's going to look yet. So I shall now pass over back to Dan, the oracle as I call him, to take it on to the next step, which is the policies.
And just noticing that we have got some questions coming in. I have had a quick look at those. If it's all right with the people who posted those questions, we'll zap through the rest of the slides, pick those up in the Q&A bit at the end. I think we've got answers for those. I think I've even thought about the one from earlier on as well, so we should be okay. So next slide, please. Why does it matter what your policies are? Well, it matters because you've now got to think about where your policies come to bear on how you will operate the procurements that you run under the new legislation and how they will become visible in these various notices that we've talked about. So, yeah, you'll have a procurement policy, you'll have a VFM policy. You'll have diversity, you'll have equal ops, you'll have a social value policy, you'll have lots of others. Bear in mind all the ones that may be relevant. Why do they come to bear on the Procurement Act and procurement regulations? They may be articulated in one of these notices. At the pre-procurement stage, are there conditions for participation that are based on one of your policies? Do you have a policy that there are certain kinds of organisation you want to deal with, or certain kinds that you won't? So bear that in mind, because it may not be easy to introduce that kind of requirement at a later stage if you missed it out at the start. In the award criteria, will they be reflected? Or bearing in mind, you've got to put the award criteria front and centre at, or certainly before or no later than the tender notice. So you need to know in advance what you're going to hold against anybody or what's going to enable them to score well. So one option is you just list all the policies on the back of the contract and say compliance is a requirement. Fine. If you're scoring the bidder's ability to indicate an ability to comply, then it's an award criterion. So then you've got to get it out there and indicate it. And If you are setting KPIs, and bearing in mind the legislation says you should be setting KPIs for all public contracts unless you are unable to do so, why not have KPIs informed by your priorities and your policies? If you've got to measure something, potentially measure things you actually care about and things that you are required to achieve. So for those of you, for example, in the social housing sector, you've got those tenant satisfaction criteria that you're reporting against. Maybe you want some KPIs related to those if the contractor is meant to be helping you. Loads of reporting obligations in the education field, in the local government field. So maybe you can tie those up. So if you've got to have them, maybe make them work for you. So let's look now at the question of what are the tactics. So as with chess, it is the case that once you've learned the rules of the game, the question then is, how do we play this most successfully? And I think, as with anybody who's running a procurement, you can also see from Bobby Fisher on the left there, he could probably do with a bit more time to think about it, and he'd rather have fewer people watching him do it. But unfortunately, under the Procurement Act, everybody gets to see what you're doing because you have to publish a long string of notices. So bearing that in mind, how can you take advantage? So these notices are, to the extent that they apply to you, you're going to have to do it. So they will be a milestone coming around for reporting. You've got the payments ones coming around every 6 months. You've got the KPI reporting coming around at least once a year. It's not your decision, and you can remind the contractor of that. You've just got to do it. But what it may do is provide a very useful prompt for the contractor to engage with the contract management process, particularly if the alternative is that you're going to publish a notice the contractor would not like you to have published. So bear in mind, direct awards, published. Variations, published. So where you have an incumbent provider who says, come on, just give us a bit more time, just extend it, nobody needs to know, they totally need to know it's all going to be published. Can you avoid publication of these notices? Can you give it the Matt Gates and quit before the adverse report about you is published? Well, no, actually, because the Procurement Regulations 24 has seen you coming. KPI performance notices are published every year, and you'll remember earlier, and at termination of the contract. So even if you bin the contractor off within a year because of their terrible performance, you'll still have to publish a KPI assessment using the 5 grades at the point when the contract is terminated. So it's actually going to be fairly difficult for a contractor to perform badly without generating some kind of footprint about that deficient performance. However, it is fair to assume that contractors don't really want that to happen, and if it's going to, might be prepared to work quite hard to try to head it off. So bear in mind that leverage may come and go at different points in the contract's life cycle, depending on when the next notice is due to be published. So let's talk about KPIs specifically, because I think they deserve a mention here. You're meant to set at least 3 unless it can't be measured. So assuming there are going to be KPIs, my question is this, a little like, is orange the new black? Are KPIs the new award criteria? Why do I say they might be? Well, as you'll all know, if you've suffered any kind of procurement challenge, award criteria are minutely dissected, argued about. Have they been applied correctly to within 1/100th of a percentage point? Did you score that properly? Should I have had a better mark? Well, now that you've got to publish the KPI assessment, why won't contractors say, I deserved a good, you've given me a close, or you've given me an inadequate, I dispute that assessment. You've published a notice saying that I'm worse than I really am. So be prepared. Contractors might not take your assessment lying down. Equally, if you're going to say, this contract just isn't suitable for the use of KPIs, be ready to have to justify that, because the whole point of this, if we go back to the start, is that you're supposed to be laying out there how the contract is going in practice after you procured it and awarded it with such a fanfare of notices. So you are applying an exemption to the usual rule, and it will be interpreted narrowly. For fans of the James Waste Management case, I think that general rule would apply here as well. So finally, termination and debarment. Think carefully about how you're going to describe termination in the notice. Are you specifically going to invoke section 71 subsection 5 and say this is a termination as a result of breach of contract or as a result of unsatisfactory and unimproved performance? Could that be challenged? Is it like the potential liability for giving a negligently bad job reference if it costs somebody a job in the future and the thing you scrawled on their reference form was actually untrue because you hadn't bothered to check it carefully? So be very, very careful at the point you publish one of these, because I would imagine they are not without consequence. Bearing in mind, we talked in the last section about the new debarment list, the big list of who is excluded and excludable. The way it works, it's the contracting authority that applies the exclusion that must then report to the proper authorities to determine whether or not that contractor is going on the debarment list. So it's not your responsibility if you publish a notice saying sanctioned for unsatisfactory performance or breach. It's the next authority who says, well, given that I've noticed that you've been sanctioned for this, I can treat you as excludable. I have excluded you. I'm now reporting the fact you've been excluded. That's what triggers the next stage. And if you are that organisation, note that under section 100 of the Procurement Act, the supplier cannot take legal action on the basis that the minister who decides to put them on the list has acted in an unlawful way or made an unlawful decision. What I'll notice there is they can't have a swing at the minister, but they might have a swing at whoever grassed them up to the minister if ultimately they appeal their way out of being on the debarment list. So again, if you've got to do it, you've got to do it, but it seems very unlikely that the contractor you've excluded is going to want to be excluded if the consequence is they immediately get reported to the government. So this is unlikely to be without consequence. Just think it through before you press the big red button marked exclude. So that takes us, I think, to the Q&A section. So let me put up the Q&A, the number of which is steadily rising. Let's have a look. So if you're a large group with multiple subsidiary contracting authorities, does the pipeline notice apply to the group or the individual subsidiary contracting authority? I will take another look, or more accurately, I will get our trainee to take another look to see whether there is a specific reference to that. My view would be there are references in the regulations and in the legislation to an anti-avoidance type approach. So artificially dividing contracts to produce subtotals, all of which are under 100 million, might be potentially open to criticism. Do we have to publish contract details notice if the potential contract value is less than 5 million? Yes, you have to publish an award notice and a contract details notice, even for sub-threshold contracts. The 5 million threshold is for when you have to publish the whole contract, not just the summary. Is the payment dated from the date the payment was approved or the date the payment left the bank? That isn't the distinction, but there is a reference in the relevant part of the regulations to say you can treat a payment as received by the recipient when it should have been received, so you can allow for your bank cocking it up and not getting the money there. What you can't do is not have sent the money in time. So I think you must have actually attempted the payment. Our contract procurement notices for all contract values, my understanding is they will be for contracts to which the regulations apply. So they will be contracts over the threshold. I think that sounds about right, Gemma. That's my understanding of it. Tiny little contracts don't trigger the full procurement process. The process maps for each stage and documents provided at the various stages. Well, you've been looking at them, Gemma.
No, I've not found anything. I've been digging about, and unfortunately what I've provided is all there is at the moment. Yeah,
we also had one of the stated reasons for delaying the implementation of the legislation was that the new government wanted to change and republish the National Procurement Policy Statement. And I don't think we've seen the new one of those either yet. It would appear from my casual look at the news that they may have a few other things on at the moment. So we'll remain to see how close to the deadline we get. Do you have to publish results for every contract with KPIs or only contracts over a certain value? Again, my understanding would be that the full application of legislation is to contracts which themselves are over the threshold for the application. So if you've got a sub-threshold contract, you've got a sub-threshold tender notice, you've got a contract details, you've got award notice, but that's as far as you would go if you're sub-threshold. If we call for a framework letter under the PCI 2015, you have to publish an award notice. My understanding would be that no, that is a contract award governed by the old regulations rather than the new ones. Do note, please, that the transitional provisions from PCR 15 to Procurement Act 23 do specify, certainly for live dynamic purchasing systems, how long beyond the change they can carry on running and keep generating new awards. So don't trip over that bit. There is an ultimate shutdown date for when you can stop stringing out a process that's still got its feet in the old rules.
Well done. Blimey. I think Dan needs oxygen, Carly and Hannah, who's
well, fortunately, in the office where I'm sitting, there is a diesel-powered coffee machine not far from where I am, and I'm going to go and find it in a minute. But
I can't say I blame you.
Well, hopefully that's been useful. We'll very briefly mention forthcoming attractions. We do have session 4 coming up on the 26th of February.
Yep.
You get ready for this session. And what we would invite anybody who's wanting to book for that session, number 1, please do. And number 2, send in your questions. Send them to anybody at Forbes that you normally deal with, or to me or Gemma. Details are on the slides. Or to our colleagues in our events team who will be sending out the follow-up information. We'd like to target that session on effectively frequently asked questions that people want to try to get clear before it's too late. So if you've got any of those, chuck them into the mix, please, because that helps us make it as useful as possible.
Thanks ever so much, everybody, for joining. We really do appreciate it. Well done, Dan. And we hope you have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you ever so much for joining us, everybody. Take care. Bye.